Picture this. You're walking through the opulent halls of the Habsburg Palace in Vienna, and you notice something deeply unsettling about the portraits lining the walls. Generation after generation of royal faces stare back at you, but there's something wrong with their features. Jutting jaws that seem to defy human anatomy, eyes that bulge unnaturally from their sockets, and facial deformities so severe they look like caricatures rather than actual people. What you're witnessing isn't artistic license or poor painting technique. You're looking at the devastating physical consequences of centuries of royal inbreeding, where the pursuit of pure bloodlines created some of the most shocking birth defects in recorded history. Before diving into these forgotten stories of genetic catastrophe, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths behind royal dynasties, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these royal secrets together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the darker chapters of history. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of royal excess or political intrigue. This is the story of how the obsession with keeping bloodlines pure led to genetic disasters that would make modern scientists recoil in horror. We're talking about deformities so severe they changed the course of empires, mental conditions so debilitating they sparked wars, and physical abnormalities so shocking that court painters had to develop entirely new techniques just to make their royal subjects look remotely human. The Habsburg dynasty, which ruled much of Europe for over 6 centuries, provides us with the most documented and disturbing examples of what happens when royal families become their own genetic experiments. But they weren't alone. From the Egyptian pharaohs to the British royals, from Spanish kings to Russian czars, the practice of marrying within the family created a parade of genetic horrors that would have been impossible to imagine if they weren't so thoroughly documented by court physicians and historians. Let's start with the most infamous example, the Habsburg jaw. This wasn't just a family trait or a distinctive feature. It was a grotesque deformity that became progressively worse with each generation of inbreeding. The technical term is mandibular prognathism, but the reality was far more disturbing than any medical textbook could convey. We're talking about lower jaws that protruded so far forward that normal eating became impossible. Speech was severely impaired, and the simple act of closing one's mouth required tremendous effort. The condition reached its horrifying peak in Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king, whose jaw jutted out so dramatically that he couldn't chew solid food properly and drooled constantly. Court records describe a man whose tongue was so large it barely fit in his mouth, whose lower jaw extended so far beyond his upper jaw that his teeth couldn't meet, and whose appearance was so shocking that foreign diplomats would write detailed reports back to their home countries describing the king's monstrous visage. But the Habsburg jaw was just the beginning. The royal family's genetic problems cascaded through multiple organ systems, creating a symphony of dysfunction that modern geneticists are still studying today. We're talking about enlarged heads that required specially designed crowns, eyes that bulged so severely they couldn't close properly during sleep, and facial asymmetries so pronounced that one side of a person's face looked like it belonged to a completely different individual. The Egyptian pharaohs took royal inbreeding to even more extreme levels, with brothers marrying sisters as a matter of religious and political necessity. They believed that keeping the bloodline pure would preserve their divine connection to the gods, but what they actually preserved was a collection of genetic defects that would have made their subjects question the very concept of divine blessing. Archaeological evidence from royal mummies reveals the true cost of this practice: spinal deformities, club feet, and cranial abnormalities that paint a picture of immense physical suffering hidden behind the golden masks of pharaonic power. Tutankhamun, perhaps the most famous pharaoh of all, was himself a victim of this genetic catastrophe. Modern DNA analysis has revealed that he suffered from multiple congenital defects, including a cleft palate, spinal curvature, and a clubfoot that required him to walk with a cane. The boy king who has fascinated the world for decades was actually a severely disabled teenager whose royal bloodline had been poisoned by generations of incestuous marriages. The physical deformities were often accompanied by mental and neurological problems that were equally devastating. Royal families across Europe produced generation after generation of rulers who suffered from severe mental illness, epilepsy, and cognitive disabilities that made effective governance nearly impossible. The irony is profound. The very practice designed to preserve royal superiority actually created rulers who were fundamentally incapable of ruling effectively. Take the case of the Portuguese royal family, where inbreeding produced Maria the Fair, known as Maria the Mad, whose mental breakdown was so severe that she had to be forcibly removed from power. Her condition wasn't just political instability or the stress of ruling, it was the direct result of generations of genetic accumulation that had created a brain chemistry incapable of handling the demands of reality. The Spanish Bourbon line provides us with equally disturbing examples. Ferdinand VII, whose reign we've explored in previous videos, was just one in a long line of Spanish monarchs whose physical and mental abnormalities were the direct result of royal inbreeding. The practice had become so ingrained in royal culture that marrying outside the family was considered a betrayal of royal duty, even when the genetic consequences were becoming impossible to ignore. What makes these stories particularly haunting is how the royal families and their courts developed elaborate systems to hide or minimize the appearance of these defects. Court painters became masters of diplomatic portraiture, learning to paint royal subjects from angles that minimize their deformities, to use shadows and lighting to disguise protruding jaws, and to employ artistic techniques that made their subjects appear more human than they actually were. The clothing industry adapted as well, creating specialized garments designed to hide physical abnormalities. We're talking about custom-made clothing that could disguise hunched backs, enlarged heads, and limb deformities. Royal tailors became experts in creating illusions, using padding, special cuts, and innovative designs to create the appearance of normal human proportions where none existed. Even the architecture of royal palaces was modified to accommodate the physical limitations of inbred monarchs. Staircases were built with unusual proportions to accommodate those with mobility issues. Doorways were widened for those with enlarged heads or unusual gaits, and furniture was specially designed to support bodies that didn't conform to normal human anatomy. The most tragic aspect of this genetic catastrophe was how it affected the children born into these royal families. Imagine being born with severe physical deformities, knowing that your suffering was the direct result of your ancestors' decisions, and understanding that your own children would likely inherit even worse conditions. The psychological impact of this knowledge, combined with the physical pain of living with severe genetic defects, created a cycle of trauma that echoed through generations. Court physicians of the era were well aware of the connection between royal inbreeding and the increasing frequency of birth defects, but they were powerless to speak openly about it. Medical records from various European courts reveal doctors who privately documented the genetic horrors they witnessed while publicly maintaining the fiction that royal bloodlines were blessed by divine favor. These physicians developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for managing the medical crises that accompanied royal births. They created specialized medical equipment for infants born with severe deformities, developed feeding techniques for babies who couldn't nurse normally, and invented early forms of physical therapy to help royal children develop whatever functionality their genetics would allow. The birth defects weren't limited to visible physical abnormalities. Many royal children were born with internal organ defects that made survival beyond infancy unlikely. Heart malformations, kidney problems, and digestive system abnormalities were common, creating a situation where royal families had to produce many children just to ensure that one or two might survive to adulthood. The survival rates among royal children were so abysmal that it became a matter of state security. European courts began to view royal pregnancies not as joyous occasions, but as medical emergencies, requiring teams of specialists, backup plans, and contingency protocols. The infant mortality rate among inbred royal families was astronomically higher than among the general population, creating a demographic crisis that threatened the very concept of hereditary monarchy. What's particularly disturbing is how these genetic disasters became normalized within royal circles. Courtiers learned to speak around the obvious physical and mental defects of their rulers, developing elaborate codes of etiquette that avoided drawing attention to royal disabilities. Diplomatic protocols were rewritten to accommodate monarchs who couldn't speak clearly, couldn't walk normally, or couldn't control their bodily functions in public settings. The Habsburg family tree reads like a horror novel when you understand the genetic implications. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, married his first cousin, Isabella of Portugal. Their son, Philip II, married his first cousin, Maria Manuela of Portugal, then later married his own niece, Anna of Austria. Philip III married his first cousin, Margaret of Austria. Philip IV married his first cousin, Elizabeth of France. Each generation, the genetic pool became smaller and the defects more severe, creating a cascade of dysfunction that would ultimately doom the dynasty. The mathematical reality of this inbreeding is staggering. By the time Charles II was born, his coefficient of inbreeding was higher than that of children born to full siblings. Geneticists have calculated that he had fewer unique ancestors than a typical person born to unrelated parents would have great-grandparents. His family tree wasn't a tree at all. It was a genetic knot that had tied itself into an impossible configuration. The physical manifestations of this genetic catastrophe extended far beyond the famous Habsburg jaw. Royal children were born with limbs that didn't develop properly, creating arms and legs that were either too short, too long, or bent at impossible angles. Some were born with extra fingers or toes, while others were missing essential body parts entirely. The royal nurseries became specialized medical facilities equipped to handle infants whose bodies had been twisted by generations of genetic accumulation. Mental retardation was so common among royal children that it became a standard expectation rather than a tragic exception. Many royal heirs never developed the cognitive abilities necessary for basic self-care, let alone the complex demands of statecraft. These individuals would be hidden away in remote wings of palaces, cared for by specialized staff who were sworn to secrecy about their conditions. The neurological problems were equally devastating. Royal families produced generation after generation of individuals who suffered from severe epilepsy, with seizures so violent and frequent that they required constant medical supervision. The seizures weren't just medical emergencies, they were political crises that could destabilize entire kingdoms when they occurred during important state functions or diplomatic meetings. Some royal children were born with conditions so severe that they were essentially vegetables from birth, requiring round-the-clock care and having no awareness of their surroundings. These tragic figures would live for years or even decades in specialized facilities, consuming enormous resources while providing nothing in return except a reminder of the genetic prices their families had paid for their obsession with bloodline purity. The psychological impact on the royal families themselves was profound. Parents who had been raised to believe in their genetic superiority found themselves producing children who were obvious genetic failures. The cognitive dissonance between royal ideology and genetic reality created a culture of denial so pervasive that it infected every aspect of court life. Royal mothers often suffered severe depression and anxiety disorders after giving birth to severely deformed children. Court records reveal cases of royal women who refused to see their newborn children, who developed what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, and who required extensive medical treatment for conditions that their physicians couldn't properly diagnose or treat. The economic cost of managing these genetic disasters was enormous. Royal households had to maintain specialized medical staff, custom manufacturing for adaptive equipment, and secret facilities for housing family members who were too deformed or mentally disabled to appear in public. The resources that should have been devoted to governance and military affairs were instead consumed by the medical needs of genetically compromised royalty. International relations were complicated by the obvious genetic problems of royal families. Foreign diplomats would return home with detailed reports about the physical and mental conditions of their hosts. Information that was used to assess the stability and long-term viability of various kingdoms. A king who couldn't speak clearly or walk normally was viewed as a weak negotiating partner and a potentially unreliable ally. The marriage negotiations between royal families became increasingly complex as genetic defects became more obvious and more severe. Potential brides and grooms were subjected to detailed medical examinations, and marriage contracts began including clauses about what would happen if children were born with severe defects. Some royal marriages were cancelled when one party's genetic problems became too obvious to ignore. The religious implications were equally troubling. Royal families had justified their inbreeding practices by claiming divine sanction, but the obvious genetic consequences raised uncomfortable questions about whether God actually approved of their behavior. Court theologians found themselves in the impossible position of having to explain why divinely blessed bloodlines were producing such obviously cursed offspring. The artistic and cultural impact of royal genetic disasters can be seen in the evolution of court portraiture and ceremonial protocols. Artists developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for disguising physical deformities, while court ceremonies were modified to minimize the visibility of royal disabilities. The very culture of European nobility was shaped by the need to accommodate and hide the genetic consequences of inbreeding. Some royal families began to recognize the connection between inbreeding and genetic defects, but their attempts to address the problem were often too little, too late. By the time they began seeking marriage partners outside their immediate genetic circles, the damage had already been done. The genetic load accumulated over generations couldn't be reversed by a single generation of outbreeding. The medical profession of the era struggled to understand and treat the genetic conditions they were seeing in royal families. Without knowledge of genetics, heredity, or DNA, physicians could only document the symptoms and attempt to manage the most severe complications. Their medical records provide us with detailed descriptions of genetic horrors that they couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. The tragedy of royal inbreeding reached its most horrifying crescendo in the phenomenon known as royal monsters, children born with deformities so severe that they challenged the very concept of human form. Palace records, hidden away in Vatican archives and royal libraries across Europe, contain descriptions that read like medieval accounts of demons rather than medical documentation of human births. Consider the case of Prince Johann of Austria, born in 1629 to parents who were double first cousins. Court physicians recorded that the infant was born with what they described as a head of impossible proportions, a skull so enlarged that it required specially constructed cradles and could not be supported by the child's neck muscles. The prince's eyes were positioned at different heights on his face, creating an asymmetry so pronounced that observers reported feeling physically ill when looking at him directly. But Johann's condition was merely the beginning of a cascade of genetic horrors that would define his short life. His limbs developed at different rates, creating arms that were grotesquely mismatched in length and hands that possessed varying numbers of fingers. Court records describe digits that were fused together in ways that created claw-like appendages, while other fingers were so underdeveloped they appeared more like small growths than functional body parts. The prince's internal organs were equally compromised. Palace physicians noted that his breathing was laboured from birth, suggesting severe respiratory abnormalities, while his digestive system was so malformed that he could only consume specially prepared liquids. The child's nervous system was catastrophically damaged, resulting in seizures that were so violent they required multiple servants to prevent him from injuring himself during episodes. Perhaps most disturbing was the prince's vocal development. Instead of normal human speech, Johann could only produce sounds that court observers described as inhuman wailing that echoed through the palace corridors like the cries of a wounded animal. The psychological impact on palace staff was so severe that many requested transfers to other duties, unable to cope with the daily reality of caring for a child whose very existence seemed to mock the concept of divine royal blessing. The Habsburg family's attempts to manage these genetic catastrophes led to the development of what historians now call royal eugenics, primitive attempts at selective breeding that were centuries ahead of their time, but based on superstition rather than scientific understanding. Court physicians began maintaining detailed records of which family combinations produced the most severe defects, creating early genetic charts that mapped the hereditary patterns of royal dysfunction. These medical records reveal the emergence of specific genetic syndromes that became associated with particular royal bloodlines. The Habsburg cluster included not just the famous jaw deformity, but a constellation of related abnormalities: enlarged tongues that couldn't fit properly in the mouth, teeth that grew at bizarre angles, and facial bones that developed asymmetrically, creating countenances that looked like they had been assembled from mismatched parts. The Spanish Bourbon line developed its own signature genetic horrors. Children born into this bloodline frequently suffered from what palace physicians called the royal tremor, a neurological condition that caused uncontrollable shaking that would begin in infancy and worsen throughout life. By adulthood, affected individuals would be unable to hold objects, write their names, or perform basic tasks that required fine motor control. The tremor was accompanied by what court records describe as episodes of royal madness, periods of violent psychotic behaviour that would strike without warning. During these episodes, affected royals would experience hallucinations, speak to people who weren't there, and display strength that required multiple guards to restrain them. The attacks could last for hours or days, leaving the individual exhausted and with no memory of their actions. French royal bloodlines contributed their own genetic nightmares to the catalogue of royal birth defects. The Bourbon-Orléans branch produced children with a condition that palace physicians called the royal disease, a bleeding disorder that we now know as hemophilia. But the manifestation in these royal children was far more severe than typical cases, with bleeding episodes that were so frequent and severe that affected individuals lived in constant fear of minor injuries that could prove fatal. The hemophilia created a culture of extreme protectiveness around royal children that bordered on imprisonment. Affected princes were forbidden from participating in normal childhood activities, couldn't learn to ride horses, and were prohibited from any physical contact that might result in bruising or bleeding. They lived in padded chambers, surrounded by medical staff, existing more as medical specimens than as human beings. The psychological impact of these restrictions was devastating. Royal children who suffered from hemophilia often developed severe anxiety disorders, depression, and what we would now recognize as agoraphobia. They became afraid of their own bodies, terrified of any activity that might trigger a bleeding episode, and withdrew into fantasy worlds where they could escape the reality of their genetic prison. The British royal family's encounter with haemophilia through Queen Victoria's bloodline created political crises that reverberated across Europe. When Victoria's affected descendants married into other royal houses, they carried the genetic time bomb with them, creating a network of royal families dealing with the same devastating condition. The disease became a diplomatic factor, with marriage negotiations including discussions about genetic risks and the potential for producing affected heirs. The most tragic aspect of royal hemophilia was how it affected the relationship between parents and children. Royal mothers lived in constant terror that their sons might suffer fatal bleeding episodes, while royal fathers struggled with the knowledge that their bloodlines were carrying a genetic curse that could destroy their dynasties. The emotional toll on royal families was immense, creating psychological trauma that echoed through generations. Russian royal history provides us with perhaps the most dramatic example of how genetic defects could alter the course of world events. Tsarevich Alexei, heir to the Russian throne, suffered from hemophilia so severe that his condition became a state secret that influenced major political decisions. The boy's bleeding episodes were so frequent and life-threatening that his parents, Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra, became desperate for any treatment that might save their son's life. This desperation led them to Rasputin, the mysterious healer whose influence over the royal family ultimately contributed to the Russian Revolution and the fall of the Romanov dynasty. A genetic defect that began with Queen Victoria's bloodline ended up changing the political landscape of the entire world, demonstrating how royal inbreeding could have consequences that extended far beyond the palace walls. The development of photography in the 19th century created new challenges for royal families trying to hide their genetic problems. Unlike painted portraits, which could be diplomatically modified, photographs revealed the true extent of royal deformities with unforgiving clarity. Royal families had to develop new strategies for managing their public image, including careful staging of photographs, strategic use of clothing and props, and extensive retouching that was primitive by modern standards, but revolutionary for its time. Some royal families simply refused to be photographed, creating an air of mystery that actually enhanced their mystique while hiding their genetic realities. Others employed court photographers who became specialists in diplomatic photography, learning to use lighting, angles, and composition to minimize the appearance of physical defects while still creating images that could be used for official purposes. The advent of motion pictures created even greater challenges. Royal families could no longer rely on carefully composed static images to hide their genetic problems. Moving pictures revealed the reality of royal disabilities, the awkward gaits, the difficulty with speech, the tremors and seizures that had previously been hidden from public view. This technological revolution forced many royal families to retreat further from public life, accelerating the decline of absolute monarchy as a viable form of government. The medical costs of managing royal genetic disasters became so enormous that they began to affect national budgets. Royal households employed teams of specialized physicians, maintained private hospitals within palace grounds, and funded research into treatments for genetic conditions that affected only their bloodlines. The resources devoted to royal medical care could have funded public health initiatives that would have benefited thousands of ordinary citizens. Some royal families began importing foreign physicians and medical equipment in desperate attempts to find treatments for their genetic conditions. Court records reveal payments to doctors from across Europe and beyond, along with expenditures for experimental treatments that ranged from the merely ineffective to the actively harmful. The royal quest for genetic redemption became a form of medical tourism that predated the modern phenomenon by centuries. The secrecy surrounding royal genetic problems created a shadow medical profession of doctors who specialized in treating conditions that officially didn't exist. These physicians were sworn to absolute silence about their royal patients, creating a medical underground that operated parallel to mainstream medicine. Their private notes and correspondence discovered centuries later provide our most detailed insights into the true extent of royal genetic catastrophes. The impact on royal succession laws was profound. As genetic defects made more and more royal heirs unfit for rule, European monarchies had to develop increasingly complex succession protocols that could bypass genetically compromised individuals while maintaining the fiction of hereditary legitimacy. Some kingdoms began practicing what amounted to selective succession, choosing heirs based on their relative genetic fitness rather than strict birth order. The psychological toll on royal families extended beyond the immediate victims of genetic defects. Siblings of affected individuals often suffered from survivor's guilt, wondering why they had been spared, while their brothers or sisters had been cursed with devastating conditions. Parents faced the impossible choice between producing heirs to continue their bloodlines and risking the creation of more genetically compromised offspring. The religious crisis created by royal genetic disasters was equally profound. How could royal families maintain their claims to divine blessing when their bloodlines were producing such obviously cursed offspring? Court theologians found themselves performing increasingly elaborate mental gymnastics to explain why God would allow such suffering among his chosen representatives on earth. Some royal families began to interpret their genetic problems as divine punishment for past sins, leading to elaborate penitential practices and religious reforms that were designed to appease an apparently angry God. Others doubled down on their claims of divine favor, arguing that their willingness to endure genetic suffering was evidence of their special relationship with the divine. The cultural impact of royal genetic disasters can be seen in the evolution of European literature and art. The Gothic tradition in literature drew heavily on the reality of royal genetic horrors, creating fictional monsters that were often less terrifying than the real genetic catastrophes being produced in royal nurseries. The prevalence of cursed bloodlines and hereditary doom in European folklore reflects the very real genetic crises that were unfolding in royal families. As the 18th and 19th centuries progressed, the growing understanding of heredity began to penetrate royal circles, creating a scientific awakening that would ultimately spell the end of systematic royal inbreeding. But this knowledge came too late for many royal bloodlines, which had already accumulated genetic loads that would take generations to dilute through outbreeding.